Chapter 9, In the Kingdom of the Blind. In the Kingdom of the Blind. As Jahara had predicted, Ari returned from the circus within an hour of their arrival, and the group split in two, Firtha and Nalya going to the promenade while the others returned to the temple district to learn more of the cult before they descended into the reeking darkness of the city sewers. Firtha smiled as she listened to her new chainmail chime with every sodden step, echoing slightly in the sewer tunnel. The blacksmith she had visited had done no less than laugh in her face when she asked him about fixing the crumbling hunk of rust which was her last shirt, informing her that the repairs would cost more than it did. Obviously, her look had indicated she did not share in the joke, and he was quick to appease her with the offer of a suit he had repaired a fortnight before, which was still awaiting collection, and at only 20 gold more than the repairs would have cost. Once her mail was replaced, she and Nalya had restocked their supplies and headed back to the coronet, stopping only to leave their remaining gold with Galen, the girls sternly overseeing the record of it in his ledger before departing. By the time they had reached the inn, the others had already returned, their investigations uncovering that the cult had first emerged 4 months ago, though it had only been recently that they had begun to preach openly. But both High Watcher Oizig and Dawn Master Creel at the Temple of Lathander maintained that no signs indicated a new faith was in emergence, something Firtha could only be glad of. They had enough troubles at the moment without inviting some celestial vendetta. And so it was just as the sun was beginning to sink in the western skies, they had arrived at the sewer grate nearest to where she had first seen Gaul that afternoon, and together they descended into the reeking shadows. They had not lit the lamps for, as Nalya had reminded them, the gases down there could make it dangerous, and the only break in the darkness came from the grates to the streets above them, the regular shafts of light lining the tunnels and stretching off as far as she could see. Firtha glanced ahead of her, watching Minsk's outline as he led the way as usual, taking them confidently deeper into the maze of tunnels, a Nomen slightly behind him with herself and the druid, leaving Ari to bring up the rear with Nalya, the young noble coping rather well considering this was her first real taste of life as a mercenary. Ari had shown the girl how to kilt up the skirts of the robes they wore, Firtha lending her 2 belts for the purpose, and Nalya had looked amusingly pretty stood in the middle of the temple district, her pale blue traveling robes hitched up to her knees with Firtha's spare belts, one plain red, one green with a pattern of leaves, the girl's fine roan boots visible underneath, just ready to be ruined. Firtha herself had changed back into her boots as well, memories of the gate's watery sewers at the fore of her mind, though was much further south and she found the sewage quite solid due to season. The heat was by no means helping the smell though, and many of them had tied some scarf or the like over their faces. Firtha had begun with the same, but it didn't seem to make much difference, the magnolia oil she had dotted upon it just mixing with the reek of the sewage to leave her feeling vaguely sick. Plus it only made the heat worse and in the end she gave up, the bright turquoise cloth still hanging loosely at her neck. Firtha smiled to herself in spite of the smell, her surroundings doing little to sway the good mood she had awoken in. Her reconciliation with Jahara, combined with her first payment to Galen, had found her on much better terms with the world, and not even her quarrels with the squire had dampened her spirits. She glanced to the women next to her, warmed by the idea that if she sent her a smile she would likely get one in return. Jahara must have sensed her watching though, for she turned to her with a questioning look and Firtha could not help but grin.
2 cities I've been to in my short life. Just 2. So why is it I'm intimately acquainted with the sewage system in both?
Jahara rolled her eyes, but Firtha could see the smile her scarf was hiding.
What was Baldur's Gate like, my lady?
Came a Nomen's voice at her shoulder and the druid raised an eyebrow, Firtha suspecting the woman's thoughts mirrored her own. Why couldn't he just use her name? She paused a moment, affecting a bewildered air as she finally turned to him.
Oh, sorry, were you speaking to me?
Jahara snorted as a Nomen frowned, and Firtha continued, throwing a cursory glance about her.
The gate. Well, a little wider, but you were knee-deep in water for the most part, so I'd say it was on a par with Ithkatla. Oh, Anomen.
She laughed in face of the squire's deepening scowl.
I don't know what you want me to say. It was large and noisy and full of people, I wasn't really in a position to sightsee. The High House of Gond is worth a visit, though their security seems to have been stepped up of late. The elf song is very nice, as is Madame Rosalind's salon, though perhaps it would not be to your taste. Madame Rosalind's,
repeated Jahara, and Fritha suspected she had heard of the infamous locale.
Yes, we went with some boys from the Thieves' Guild. Thieves' Guild?
Repeated Anomen, looking appalled at the thought. He clearly hadn't heard of the salon.
Yes, Imoen and I joined to investigate the Iron Throne while we were in the gate. Spent most of my time watching Imoen flirt though.
Fritha sighed. To think she had been so cross with Imoen at the time as well, now the whole episode just seemed funny. Giggling behind them pulled Fritha from her memories though, and the three turned back to see Nalia and Ari, the pair chattering quietly through their scarves with a surreptitious look that was trained, rather worryingly, on them.
My lady.
Fritha smiled to herself, returning her attention to the squire as Jahara dropped back to hurry the girls along.
Yes, Anomen. You mentioned before when you spoke of Baldur's Gate that you had met the Grand Dukes. Oh yes, I don't know Lia or Belt so well, but Elton seemed very nice. Why do you ask?
Anomen shrugged, the nonchalance of the gesture did not suit him.
Mere curiosity. I suppose I wondered what sort of people they were. We were nearly at war with the city and it seemed they were duped into it by the Ballspawn all too easily. Perhaps, perhaps not,
said Fritha evenly.
Saravak had a talent for deception that would have left Zurich himself envious. Besides, it takes two to make a war. I do not recall your Council of the Six being any less belligerent.
Anomen nodded, his voice growing stronger as his passions rose.
That is true, though some would say they only defended what was threatened. I myself am more concerned with how they rule in times of peace. Our country is wealthy and prosperous, but still injustices prevail for the common man. I do not know why the Order does not just assume control of the Council. It could do a lot more to make this a fair and equitable land. What, just march in and take over?
Fritha confirmed, unable to keep the surprise from her voice as she turned to him. Anomen was the last person she expected to be advocating such a thing.
That doesn't sound particularly advisable, and politics has a way of corrupting even the most noble of goals. The Order should stay separate from the Council, at least that way they can each monitor the other.
Anomen frowned, a coldness creeping into his manner.
You're entitled to your opinion, my lady,
he continued, in a tone that suggested he begrudged her the right,
but I think there is more than can be done to halt the tides of chaos than simply combating the most obvious evils with a sword.
Fritha snorted.
Halt the tides of chaos? I'm not the one suggesting a military coup.
Anomen looked flustered a moment before pulling himself up to his full height, which was impressive enough in itself, and sending her an imperious glare.
At least I am suggesting something, not standing idle while such injustices continue unchecked.
He snapped, brushing past her and storming off to fall into step with Minsk at their head. Fritha sighed. Well, she agreed there was more to be done to combat evil than just fighting it, if you were that way inclined, of course. It just seemed to be on the matter of how that they were suffering a difference of opinion. Jahara walked on, her staff keeping her steady on the slimy floor, Fritha, Anomen, and Minsk just silhouettes before her in the gloom, Ari and Nalia now pointedly silent behind. Whatever they had been giggling about was to remain a mystery, it seemed, the pair stopping their chatter as soon as they had noticed her approach, and in a way that did not fill Jahara with confidence as she noted how their eyes had lingered over the squire. The last thing the group needed was an outbreak of lovesickness. She sighed deeply and instantly regretted it, the heavy, almost sweet scent of effluence making her gag. Frithha was right, they had become far too acquainted with sewage systems in the past few months, and the gloomy tunnels were doing nothing for her memories of the dungeon. The sooner they found this cult the better, especially since it had become apparent that her attendance at the local Harper Hall was expected within the 10-day. The barman at the Coronet, though she doubted as a Harper himself, was clearly in their service, and had slyly passed her the message to that effect with her drink while she, Frithha and the squire had waited for the others to join them, the pair oblivious to the exchange as they continued their quarreling. Something that it seemed they had yet to finish with, Jahara considered as she glanced up at the sound of raised voices to watch the squire march to the head of the group, the gloom doing nothing to disguise his stiff gait. Frithha was still just ahead of her, now walking alone and looking as serene as ever she did. Jahara frowned.
"What is wrong with him?"
she asked, quickening her pace to reach the girl. Frithha shrugged, apparently unfazed by the cleric's outburst.
"Oh, he's just in a huff because he thinks the order should be in control of the council, and I said I thought it should stay separate from such things. That is all."
The girl nodded mildly.
"That's it."
Jahara bristled, throwing glare at his back, guilt at her own past behavior sparking in her a fierce anger.
"Arrogant boy! I'll remove his tongue before I hear him speak to you like that again."
The girl laughed gently, but looked pleased with her reaction nevertheless.
"Oh, leave off, he's hardly worth it. I couldn't give a dried fig what he thinks of me."
Jahara gave her a sidelong glance, a slight smile tugging at her mouth.
"You know I don't think the Ilmaterans give sainthoods outside their faith."
Frithha looked instantly crestfallen.
"No, oh, that's a shame. Saint Frithha of Candlekeep has a nice ring to it." "Yes,"
she continued with distant eyes,
"Saint Frithha, Our Lady of the Resigned Sigh."
She had paused to strike what she clearly thought to be a virtuous pose, the dusty light that haloed her from the grate above only adding to the effect. Jahara smiled wryly.
"Frithha,"
she began, when the familiar rattle of plate mail caught her ear and she tapped Minsk with her staff to halt him.
"Hold, there is someone up ahead."
The group stopped, and in the tunnel's gloom she watched as the outline of a tall armored figure walked slowly towards them, comfortable enough in his plate to move in relative silence, broadsword drawn and ready. Jahara glanced to the girl next to her.
"Who was the knight Anoman spoke of before, the one already investigating this?" "Circle Dorn? Anoman, well, he said he was a knight of the order under Torm. An excellent warrior."
The girl paused to send her a pained look,
"If somewhat over-pious."
Jahara closed her eyes for the briefest of moments, overly pious by the squire's standards.
"Sylvanus, help us!"
Frithha sent her a twisted smirk, starting forward as Anoman did to greet him, the man removing his helm politely as he saw them, revealing a face much older than Jahara would have expected, the grey hair and beard neatly cropped.
"Hail citizens, I can see from your appearance that you are no strangers to risk, but pray turn back now. There are no spoils to be found down here, and only death waits for the unwary." "We are not mere laymen, sir,"
replied Anoman, with a lot more disdain than Jahara thought an aspiring squire was wise to show his superior.
"I myself am counted among the ranks of the order, along with you." "Ah yes, the squire Anoman,"
he continued genially,
"I had been told you were among those sent to investigate this matter of the cult. The gods smile upon us with this meeting."
Anoman said nothing, but looked rather sullen as though he was loath to agree with the man. Kuldorn chose not to notice, eyes sweeping over the rest of them.
Well met, friends, I am Kuldorn, humble servant of the most noble order of the Radiant Heart. It seems the squire Anoman keeps fine company, the saviors of the gate, if the rumors hold true.
Fritha glanced back and Jahara caught her eye, the girl sending her a relieved smile. It seemed their fears about the old paladin's manner had been misplaced.
And is that not the young lady Diarnis?
He continued, as his eyes fell upon Nalya.
Let me express my most sincere condolences on the passing of your father, m'lady. It is a true loss to Athkatla and her noble houses.
The girl smiled gently, looking rather warmed.
My thanks, Lord Firecombe, and, please, call me Nalya.
He smiled generously.
Certainly, if you will but consent to call me Kuldorn, we have no need of formalities here. So,
he continued, eyes traveling over their faces again, clearly searching for the leader,
since our paths have crossed and our goals are as one, shall I join with you? The way is always easier with friends.
Yes, said Fritha, and he glanced to the girl, previously overlooked, stood in the shade of the squire as she was.
I think that would be the wisest course. Ah yes,
Kuldorn smiled, finding her in the gloom.
Fritha, is it not? Prelate Wessallan has told me of you. If you would walk beside me, m'lady, perhaps we could discuss what our investigations of the cult have uncovered so far.
Fritha glanced back to her again, beaming, and Jahara felt herself smile too as the girl moved forward to fall into step with him, talking animatedly with the old paladin as the group continued on once more. Jahara looked to the squire now at her side, eyes trained on the pair before them from under a low brow. It seemed his position as voice of the order had just been usurped, and by one comfortable enough to call him squire. Jahara sighed. That the boy suffered from a deep insecurity in his own powers was clear, and this sudden humbling would likely do nothing for his manner. They continued searching for another half-hour or so, all looking for some sign or mark, the light from the grates fading as dusk fell in the world above, until Ari and Jahara had to conjure light for them to see by, the tunnels suddenly eerie in the grey-green glow. At last, Minsk made out recent tracks in the filth and they walked on with more purpose, passing strange whitewashed symbols on the damp walls, until Kuldorn brought them to a halt, a narrow tunnel, that could have been easily missed in the darkness, leading off to their left.
Do you sense it? A grave evil emanates from within. I'll warrant we have found our cult.
Right, began Fritha decisively, very aware that she may soon have a mutiny on her hands.
Our first course should be infiltration. An all-out battle may be inadvisable and perhaps impossible at this stage. And with such in mind it would for the best that we go among them as supplicants, and I do not think it wise that those of direct faith should accompany us in this.
A sudden chorus of protests rang through the tunnel.
Berver, no. By Sylvanus, what madness is this? Helmsbeard, you are not serious. That leaves only you, Nalya and Minsk. Minsk and Bu could go alone if need be. We fear nothing.
Fritha raised her hands, trying to calm the group.
As I said, we do not go to fight, and who knows what powers this Gaul has. He may be able to sense your own faith. Could you swear oaths willingly to another god?
Anoman looked set to argue the point, but another cut him off.
No, lad, the young lady speaks wisdom,
said Kuldorn, nodding gravely.
Even concealing our holy marks, we may draw unwanted suspicion.
The druid though remained unconvinced.
Perhaps, but my faith is in nature itself. He is a child of that, as are we all. I do not believe he will sense it.
Fritha hesitated a moment, but Jahara was not driven by any desire for honor or glory. if she believed such, then it was likely so. Frithha grinned.
All right, you are worth the risk, and I would prefer not to approach him myself anyway, since we met before. Had I known this would come about, I would not have said anything at all.
Frithha sighed slightly as she recalled her little sermon and shrugged.
As they say, you can see a lot further with hindsight. Indeed,
snarled Anomen.
Perhaps when you are the mercy of some foul heretics for want of our skills, the proverb will give you comfort.
Frithha sent him a sweet smile.
You know, I think it just might.
Kuldorn bowed slightly, forestalling any reply.
We shall await you here, m'lady. Gods be with you.
Frithha nodded once, following Jahara and Minsk into the passage, Nalya at her back as the two circles of light parted and the shadows closed in about them. On they walked, the darkness so absolute Jahara's where light did little more than highlight the caster, and Frithha found herself merely following the bobbing green light, stumbling after Jahara and Minsk, Nalya's presence behind her confirmed only by the girl's hand at her sleeve. The way was narrow and uneven, and more than once they had to pause to allow Minsk to turn sideways for a pace or two, his large frame too broad for the passage. But even so, the ground felt firmer underfoot, the way worn by many feet, and the smell seemed to lessen as they went, a slight breeze along the tunnel bringing fresh air in from somewhere. And it was as the passage opened out into a small chamber, that a familiar nasal voice pealed out from the darkness ahead of them and everyone stopped.
Hold, you tread on sacred ground. This place is reserved for the faithful.
Jahara lowered her staff slightly, letting the glow that hovered over the end cast light upon several men, all armed with staves. The speaker, though, was the only face close enough to make out, the green light revealing a man of middling years, two scarred healed over sockets where eyes should have looked back at her, and Jahara felt her heart recoil at such an abuse of the gifts nature had bestowed. It had to be said that subterfuge was not one of her preferred methods, her manner better suited to more direct means, but she still counted it among her skills, and her voice contained much more goodwill than she felt as she answered him.
Who are you to stop my passage? I am Gaul,
he continued in a voice just brimful of his own importance,
High Priest of the One God. The One God?
Came Nalya behind her, her young voice suiting well the feigned innocence of the question.
Yes, child, the unseeing eye. He who has shown us disciples the truth path, allowing us to achieve a higher state of wisdom.
Much nodding and muttering from his companions followed this, Jahara waiting for it subside before continuing.
So it was you who was preaching outside the Temple of Helm, it is you I seek. I wish to share in this wisdom as well.
The man smiled suddenly, his mutilated face twisting the expression into something closer to horrific as he lifted hands and sightless face to the heavens.
More faithful guided to us. This is good, though the path to enlightenment is not an easy one. Firstly, you must remove that which is limiting and offensive. The unholy eyes are removed from your head during the sacred initiation. If you survive and are proven worthy, the unseeing eye accepts you into service. Is that so?
Jahara confirmed, sounding much more composed than she felt at his talk of such abhorrent acts being so casually meted out. She glanced about her.
The sewers make a dangerous temple for the blind.
He smiled again.
The One God in His great benevolence has granted us a sense of our surroundings, our blindness is the cost of our enlightenment. Yes, and it is a cost that is too high, I fear,
she answered briskly, bowing slightly as though to take her leave, Gaul continuing quickly to forestall her.
It is a sign of weakness to refuse the enlightenment. Would you walk about willingly without arms, without feet? You would have a job to walk anywhere without feet,
she heard Frithha mutter behind her and Nalya snorted. Jahara shot a look back into the darkness.
Still,
considered Gaul slowly, as though weighing every word,
you are correct that there are dangers here for our brethren, and the one God may well have a use for such as you. An exception perhaps could be made in your case.
Jahara dipped her head in acquiescence, hoping he sensed the movement rather than the slight smile it was concealing.
I will listen.
They returned to the others but a short while later, explaining to them their agreement to retrieve a rod of great value to the one god from the catacombs that lay beneath the sewers, the priest repeating over and over the route they had to take to reach the entrance to the lower caverns until they had learned it by rote. Frithha glanced to the faces around her, the combined glow of the lights revealing their doubts.
So we are actually going to retrieve this item for them?
Confirmed a Noman with a dubious frown. Frithha smiled.
Retrieve it, yes, give it to Gaul, no. We are still supposed to be investigating the cult, and the nature of this artifact may shed some light on things. Besides, Gaul wants the artifact and I don't trust him, which means now I want the artifact, if only so he can't get his hands on it. But what will you do with it?
Asked Ari, looking slightly unnerved, the knowledge that they must travel even deeper underground clearly not resting well with her. Frithha shrugged, turning to lead them onward with a grin, hoping her confidence would strengthen their own.
Helm sent us down here, he can keep an unsleeping eye on it.
Frithha took the lead with Jahara, the pair remembering Gaul's directions between them, counting turnings and following the strange whitewash markers until at last they reached the door he had described, Frithha drawing her sword as she slowly ascended the steps, glad, at least, to be finally out of the sewage. The door was unlocked and opened easily, though not without a slight groan, a guarded voice coming clear from the darkness beyond.
Be wary, friends. Something has come before us, I can hear it.
Jahara was at her shoulder now, leaning forward with her staff to cast light over yet more blinded figures.
More cultists.
The woman confirmed, barely concealing her disdain.
What are you doing so far from the temple? Yes, you'll miss Evensong,
Frithha warned in a sing-song voice. One of the men shook his head, almost sadly, stumbling forward to meet them.
You are mistaken, we are not cultists, child. Or perhaps it is more correct to say we are no longer. Please, if you do not know of us, I must assume you are not allies of the cult. Please, we have grave need of you.
He stepped back, raising an arm to invite them in, and Frithha glanced to Jahara before moving forward, the man leading them off the main passage into a small stone cell, barely large enough for them all, the man waiting until the group was seated and settled before continuing once more.
I am Sassar, once high priest of the one god, now leader of the poor wretches you saw before. I was at one time a cleric to Helm, but I lost my way and was seduced by the cult of the unseeing eye. You left Helm's service to ally yourself with these heretics.
Came a Noman's voice, clearly outraged.
Squire Anomen.
Anomen shot Kildorn a look, but said no more, and Sassar merely shook his head.
None regret the decision more than I. When I discovered the true extent of the cult's evil, I escaped with others to come here, though the damage had already been wrought, my side taken, my faith disgraced. And you found Helm quite unforgiving of your mistake,
confirmed Frithha sadly. Sassar nodded.
Indeed he was, though rightly so. For one sworn to the service of the God of Watchers, my crime was great indeed, though I did not know its true degree until too late. The one God is actually beholder, here for an artifact of such destructive power, the gods themselves deemed it should not be used again, splitting the device in two. Ah, the rod,
confirmed Frithha.
Gaul sent us to fetch it. Indeed,
said Sassar, nodding gravely,
the beholder already possesses one half and many of his disciples have died trying to retrieve the other. The half you seek is hidden in an ancient temple beneath us, the way well guarded by creatures and traps. We ourselves have made forays also, but we lost the senses gifted us by the beholder once we left the cult. Therefore I and the others have guarded the way in Helm's name ever since, with hopes to one day restore myself in his sight.
Sassar smiled ruefully,
that he might restore mine.
Fritha felt her heart go out to him. One mistake, albeit a grave one, had seen a clearly good man blinded and now eking out an existence in the sewers. She sighed, trying to force a brightness to her voice as she continued.
Well, we were planning to retrieve the rod and take it to the Temple of Helm for safekeeping unless you have another idea of how it can be used. Yes, indeed I do, child,
Sassar cried earnestly, and Fritha could see his hands trembling in the gloom.
As I said, the beholder already has the other half of the device, but if you can find the half from below, we may have a plan to acquire the beholder's half and use the power of the artifact to kill him. Destroyed by the thing he desires most, how poetic,
observed Jahara dryly. Fritha grinned.
Even better. Bards love that sort of thing. I can see tales of this reaching all the way to the gate.
Sassar smiled, pointing to the narrow doorway behind him.
The stairs to the lower caverns are just at the end of the passage. I shall pray for your safe return. God's speed.
The group rose as one, filing through the door and along the passage to halt at the stairs, everyone making checks of their gear and weapons before the descent, Fritha helping Nalia to refill one of the lanterns, holding the lamp steady while the girl struggled to open the reservoir.
Jahara, can we have some light please, we can't see what.
Fritha stopped, the pair glancing up with surprise as a soft white glow appeared above them, balanced in the large hand of the squire.
Oh, thank you, Anomen.
He nodded once, and seemed content to leave it at that, when
before, you seemed to speak with experience you know of Helm, my lady.
Fritha glanced to him with a smile, the lantern getting heavier as Nalia filled it with oil.
Oh yes, I am well acquainted with the god of watchers. I spent many hours in the service of one of his priests back in Candle Keep. You did?
He exclaimed, quite unable to hide his amazement. She nodded mildly, the slight smile lingering as she turned back to Nalia.
Ready?
The girl nodded, returning the oil flask to her bag and lighting the wick with her flint, the flame growing steadily as she adjusted the valve and closed the pane, the shadows finally retreating. Fritha grinned, drawing her sword and turning to raise it above the waiting stairs in formal salute.
For the one god.
End of chapter.